Welcome, everyone, to the AI+HI Project podcast. And I am so thrilled to have with us today Sean White, CEO of Inflection AI, and a dear friend as well. Sean, welcome to the AI+HI Project.
Nichol, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be invited to join you.
You have a long history of being involved in human centered humanity uplifting technologies. You began your career in Mozilla and now you're leading Inflection AI. What drove you to have this focus with your career?
When I first came out to California, I started working with this professor who was working on AI. His name was Terry Winograd. And this is late early 80s, early 90s. And what he had done is he was shifting from just the purely technical to this field that hadn't quite been invented yet called human computer interaction. And so I started TAing classes for him and becoming a research assistant. And really clearly, I saw the importance of not just designing these amazing technologies, but really understanding from a philosophical standpoint and a design standpoint and a psychological standpoint how they fit with people and how they impact people and how we impact the technologies that we grow and put together. So I think that was really the starting point. And then along the way, there have been other influences, like Brenda Laurel. One of my earliest VR projects was with her, and really what it means for us to take a stance as we create technologies, right? And understanding how they fit in and to sort of iterate quickly. And then you're right. At Mozilla, which was a nonprofit, sort of at the top of the structure, there was a lot of freedom to really think about the product and projects as a public good and to make decisions that, in the end, are actually really good design decisions or really good business decisions for the long term. But it's nice to have that signaling there that you can always keep in the back of your head, or maybe in the front of your head, really, about what's good for humanity.
Mhm. Yeah, I was so thrilled when you took over at Inflection AI. And one of the things about this AI conversation that we're in is that so many people are talking about, how do we increase IQ? What is artificial intelligence? And you and I have talked a bit about human intelligence and EQ. So could you say a little bit about the Inflection AI focus on EQ versus IQ and why that's important?
Sure. And I just want to highlight, it's one of the reasons I enjoy speaking with you is that you don't look at AI and really any of these systems as a point, but really a field. And that field encompasses lots of things, right? We've been talking a lot about IQ because it's easy to measure, right? We know how to do the Scantron test. And it's also useful, but it's a thing that in some ways I think goes asymptotic at a certain point, right? You get a perfect score on your SATs. There's not much after that. The thing that I think is interesting is that the race has been towards IQ, and I would like to see the race towards EQ as well, and maybe a couple of other things. But let's start with EQ. When you and I are talking, or when we're with groups, when we're in organizations, when we are with friends or colleagues, there's a real difference when someone has EQ. And on the one hand, we could say, well, that's great. They are better at conversation. They are better at trying to understand me or understand the world around them, and they're more connected. But it turns out there's actually good scientific results about your ability to learn and your ability to act when you are feeling good versus feeling stressed and full of cortisol. And so, on the one hand, all these companies are saying, "Yeah, we'd like more soft skills in our company. We know that's important," but it's always been really hard to measure. And so, one of the interesting challenges then is, um, A, acknowledging that this is an important and beneficial thing, and then B, figuring out how we measure it, and those measurements may be a little different than the way we think about IQ. Um, and yeah, let me stop there. But there's a whole world around how we think about this that I think is really important and has been missed for the most part.
Yes. So our audience is 340,000 HR professionals and leaders around the world. And one of the things that I love about SHRM and our membership is that these people are responsible for taking care of 362 million workers and their families every week. And I love that. You and I are in the Valley, and, every week we see decks where people have total addressable markets that they never actually get to. But these are like real people who are grappling with, how do we bring AI into organizations in a way that enhances and amplifies their humanity, their ability to work together, their ability to create value together. So, like, how do we do that? And so I think, it's still at the very, very beginning of what's happening. But I think there's something around moving from this IQ focus, also in the human computer interaction, to an EQ focus that then unlocks the potential of the people who are working in organizations. And the last thing I'll say on that too, before I ask the question, is what's really exciting about the world of work is because, out of the 8 billion people on the planet, half of them work for someone. And so the vector of being able to use enterprise and organizations for humanity to figure this out, like, we have to figure this out, and we're doing it together. And so I'd love to hear what you think about how an EQ system like Pi is really relevant in the workforce and workforce transformation, especially as, like, all of these organizations are trying to figure out how to bring this online in a really healthy, supportive way to the world of work.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Um, when we start with a high level, and then maybe think about together some of these aspects. Um, at the highest level, it's clear we co-evolve with our technologies, right? And I find uh, not just AI, but large language models in general to be interesting because it's the first time that the technologies kind of come to us, learned this technology, language, this thing that we invented 100,000 years ago. These systems now have come to us as opposed to us learning SQL or one of these other weird things to communicate with it. And that's interesting to me because, you know, part of these systems that we always build with, we co-evolve with, and we can be explicit about that. And I guess what I mean is that, without naming names, there was an AI system, let's call it Alex. And people in their homes stopped saying please and thank you to Alex. And Alex was sort of a book report kind of system, so no back and forth, no EQ. And that also meant that the kids in those homes said please and thank you less. Now, I'm just using that as an example, maybe an anecdotal example of how the technologies, and particularly these AI technologies, impact um, the social interaction and the culture around them. And that gets writ large in big organizations,
Mm.
right? Um, and I think that the opposite can happen too, which is if we think about taking the culture we want, the interactions we want, and we put that in our AI systems, it's a positive feedback loop, not a negative feedback loop, right? And it gets a little complicated. That requires some fine tuning to get the kinds of interactions that a given company's culture or organization's culture or individual's culture want. But I know we can get there, and I think that's interesting because that has the potential to um, really impact a theory of change in a culture, not just in a process. and the long-term growth of an organization.
So, a little bit before you were talking about in human computer interaction, how our interfaces affect us culturally. And one of the things that we've seen is that, or it's beginning to look like it's true. A lot more data is needed and a lot more cases are needed, but it's beginning to look like a real AI transformation is a is as much a social cultural behavioral shift as it is technology. Like the technology and the data is the base case, but it's a social cultural shift. So what you answered made me think about, well, how should we be thinking about the having an AI compatible culture, and then how AI, based on your previous answer, can also affect our culture? How do those two things fit together?
Initially, one of the questions is just how you go into it. And what I mean by that is the mindset, both of the organization, the stakeholders, the company that is working, the AI company that is working with the organization. And what I mean by that is I have heard some people, like for instance, a company in customer service who seemed really excited to replace everybody, get rid of all the humans. Um, and my sense is that that actually is not a great starting point for how you start working with a company. And we, in the same way that you've heard me say that we are very clear that our AIs are machines; they are not people, and we are clear where it is AI and where it is not. Our goal is to amplify and enhance people, not replace people. And so I think first step is setting the framework in which you are introducing AI into an organization, because you can already see, like, just out in out in the wild, when there are some folks who are afraid that something is going to replace them. They try and walk away from it and hide from it as much as possible. And when there are people who see how this could amplify or accelerate the things that they do, they lean in, and then all of a sudden they are doing amazing new projects, new work, the ability to get more done, and that's what we want more of. And so there's a first stage of sort of how you frame that. Now that the next, and I think this is just as important, is then once you are starting to work. And frankly, it's an important part of EQ, right? Is active listening. That's why I wanted to make sure I understood your question. And you know, the way that we do it, or the way I think most companies should do it, is a lot like good design, or just really working with another human being, in this case, an organization, two entities, where, for instance, we do voice of the customer meetings. We'll have folks come in, often from different disciplines, different kinds of companies, talk about what their needs are, what they're afraid of, what they can imagine, and then we impedance match and share what we've done and where we're going. They learn from each other, and you iterate on the needs part, right? It's like the beginning of any good relationship. You start off by talking about all of these things a little bit, um, and that's good HCI as well. Good human computer interaction. Good, and arguably good, human centered AI development. Um, and then that last part, once you once you set the stage, once you really are understanding where those needs are, where the impedance matching is, um, there's the commitment and the work to iterate and get it right. And that does take work. It does take, in this case, for instance, certain technologies that we're quite good at, like fine tuning around um, fine tuning around, say, the culture of an organization, right? And I realize, we could probably spend hours just about what fine tuning means and all these weird little technical things about it. And I feel like I should write an explainer at some point. But really, all it is, if you have this model, you are trying to shift and change that model in various ways, either with positive or negative examples, to more closely reflect the behaviors or the belief or the knowledge that you want it to. And so, an example, so at Inflection, our first best fine tuned system was Pi. And what we fine tuned Pi on was being good at conversation, being good at being emotionally intelligent. That required 10 million different data points that were gathered about what that should look like. And then you fine tune that. And for companies, that may be, um, you know, uh, the Mozilla way or the Intel way or the things that are around that culture, that make it really fit in. Because you can going back to bringing other things in how we co-evolve. If there are things you want to enhance, this is a great place to do that. And you wouldn't, for instance, in a real person, you wouldn't hire someone that was just so way off base and disruptive that they were going to be completely different, right? Um, and that same thing is true here. Sorry, that's a
Yeah.
very long-winded answer to your, to your
Well,
thing, but we've thought a lot about it, right? Because I mean, it's important.
well, one of the things I'd like to go down a little bit deeper in is, people are starting to hear about, empathy and AI. Like, what does empathetic AI actually mean in practical terms so that like anyone can understand it? And how do we know that we've been successful at it?
Empathy, there are certain measures we use for when we think someone has empathy as a human or EQ as a human. um, uh, and measuring that is really hard. That's why you see there are fewer tests for EQ than there are for IQ.
Mm.
A million tests for IQ. Let's start with empathy. Lots of definitions for empathy, but at its core, it's this sense that the person across sees you, understands you, is connecting with you, uh, at least in human terms. And that means that they are engaged in the conversation. That means that oftentimes they are supportive, although not too supportive. Sometimes you want to be pushed. That they have some sense for you and your context and your history, that there is trust established, and that can be either quickly or slowly over time. Um, that I mentioned active listening earlier, right? That you really are trying to not just hear what someone says, but understand the intentions,
Mhm.
right? And so for all of those things, um, sometimes I've heard one person say, "Well, I know it when I see it," and that's sort of a joke, but we often feel that way about some of the soft skills. Those are the kinds of things that we build into the base, the core of Inflection AI, and that gets reflected in Pi, and then all of the enterprise systems that we use with different companies. Now, the uh, actually, let me stop there. How do you think about empathy?
Well, I think so in the context of our audience, some of the things that I've been thinking about is the use of AI in training, in skilling. We're also looking at, or the world is starting to look at skills-based assessments, skills-based hiring. People are thinking less about degrees. How do we, we actually have a worker shortage in this country, and it's only going to increase as the smaller number of 18 to 20-year-olds start to go into the workforce. And so, we need to be able to retrain everyone, to get them using AI as well as many, many other things, and to be able to bring a larger group of people into the workforce through skills based assessments. One of the things about the process of learning is that, learning from a tender, empathetic interaction that is, intense, but soft. Like when anyone thinks about their most favorite teacher, the teacher that they got the most out of that experience, those people often had incredibly high standards, but you felt like your education, that your growth and development mattered to them. And so I think as we start to use AI in learning and development for millions of people to retrain the workforce and then also bring new people in, I think that's going to be an essential part. So you may not need empathy in your accounting AI, like what? You may not, but you absolutely are going to need it in your learning and development AI, which is really relevant to our audience. So I think it sort of depends. But one of the things that I do think is really important, which you and I have chatted about before, and I'd like to talk about here, is the importance of, you know, even as these AIs get more and more empathetic, it always being clear that this is not a human. Could you to how you think about that?
Yeah. Um, yes. So I want to respond to one of the things you said. You said many great things there, but one of them around education, and then about how we think about it not being a human. So you talked about education. I'm a huge fan of Sal Khan and the way he thinks about not just education but learning, right? Which is that we all learn at a different pace, and we learn in different ways. One of the things I tend to find that is true for me, but I think is true for a lot of people, is the Socratic dialogue. The back and forth is more powerful than listening to a lecture and hoping you catch all of that stuff. And AIs are the AI systems that we are building right now are perfect for that because they're patient. They are general. You could build them to be judgmental, but generally they are not. And it really flips the 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 sort of locus of responsibility in some ways to let you be a learner, not just that you are being educated, right? It lets you choose how you are asking questions and learning. And even with your AI finance software, that's going to be useful, right? That it is not just about uh, something being fed to you, or education or book report. Now, to the question, which I think is a really interesting one. Um, there are a few ways to think about it. One, and I think I mentioned this before, but we really don't want people to think about these as human, right? Um, uh, because they're not. They're machines. They're code with data. I know that there are people working on AGI, and they talk about that a lot, and that is great. But there is so much that we can do with what we have right now, and it's so powerful. That's where we focus. And there are a couple ways that we talk about that. There's been a lot of work, starting with folks like Cliff Nass and BJ Fogg about how we respond to computers when they act human-like. And in some ways, this is a bit like the placebo effect. And I was at a conference in the summer, a brain mind conference, and the audience was asked, about 50% MDs, what do you think about the value of the placebo effect? Is it positive or negative? And every person raised their hand on positive. So sugar pills are good because they help people. Placebo effect is good. And I have been thinking about that a lot in terms of the AI systems we have. That is, when I have someone tell me I love Pi or I love Inflection, I use it all the time, and it's really helping me. That's great. Um, when someone like the day after I joined, and I tell the story a lot, I think, but the day after I joined, I had someone email me and say, "I just want you to know my mom died. I couldn't get a therapist, but Pi helped me through it." And that seems like a net positive, a net good. Um, and then in that context, it's super important for us to keep reiterating that these systems are AI systems and not people, right? And this is, I feel like I've had so many conversations about this, in part sometimes where I thought that people were saying, this is a case where we were having a discussion with Esther Dyson, and I thought she was saying, no, AIs should not be used. And I was saying, yes, I think they should be used. And what we came to is we actually were both agreeing it was that it was important to be clear that the system was an AI, not a human. And frankly, this is when I was at Mozilla talking with our amazing legal team. There are these terms of service that show up everywhere, right? Nobody reads them. They're all like 50 pages long. Um, and the shortcut, the shorthand that they used that I thought was great was users shouldn't be surprised, right? They shouldn't be surprised about their privacy. They shouldn't be surprised about what's on the other side. And same way here. I think they shouldn't be surprised. So we need to always be reminding them these are just systems. They're meant to augment you and help you. They're not people.
Well, one of the predictions that I have is that I think that responsible AI as a governing system inside organizations, I think it will ultimately migrate its way into HR. Um, and 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 it's because IT might implement the the systems, but HR holds the social contract with the organization, with the employees. They touch them more than anyone. They're vertically and horizontally integrated across the organization. They're the ones that set up the employment contracts and negotiate like the whole thing. So I think eventually it will migrate there. And so when I say this to some of our members, their questions are, okay, what does that look like? What does that practically mean? So for an HR leader who is in the room when software systems are being evaluated and there's this empathetic human sort of thing, what are the things that they should stand for? What are the things that they should be looking for? How can they serve their organizations around empathetic AI in AI systems?
That's a great question. So I'm going to brainstorm for a moment here.
Okay.
Uh, as you were saying that, I was thinking, right, well, I mean, for a lot of systems that get built by IT, right, you say, okay, well, what are the business policies? And we will make those business policies reflect in our systems, and then they will work, and maybe we'll evaluate against them. Um, and for AI systems, in particular, like for instance, with us at Inflection, we're one of maybe 8 to 10 companies in the world that can build them at this scale, 350 billion parameters. It's a big AI system. And because of that responsibility, we always have a loop where we have our policies, then we do our fine tuning and our training and fine tuning, and then we evaluate against the policies. Right? And those policies aren't just business policies; those policies are cultural policies, for instance. And I can imagine that for an HR organization, that they could be responsible for what the cultural policies are in their AI, because every organization is different, right? And they already, in some ways, I think every organization already has some sense for what your cultural policies are, and they interact with their business policies. Um, uh, you know, and let's say we would like to believe there are societal policies that we all agree on. But for every individual organization, I can see where the people teams really are thoughtful about what that means and how that shows up in each organization, and it's distinct from the business policies that you have in there, and that those are part of the evaluation cycle because AI systems change and they evolve, and I mean that just in adding new code, new functionalities, particularly new agentic systems that we and others have coming online. But I think that would be a really interesting way to sort of separate out the concerns and think about it.
Yeah, I love that. And also, I think that, one of the big TLDRs is basically like periodically there should be a message that says, this is not a real person. I love the way Pi does it periodically is Pi will say, I'm an AI system, and it's just interjected in there depending on the question. And so I think that's very helpful. Well, we're coming to a close of our time. I so appreciate your time. I think it would be wonderful to do a focus, maybe a special meeting with Pi or with Inflection and HR leaders to really talk about like what does a cultural policy look like when AI systems are being evaluated, because culture is constantly changing and the AI systems are constantly changing. It's like coming next are the world simulators. So, it's like it's really changing so fast that it has to be the responsible AI inside of organizations has to be a living, iterative, solution. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you.
Uh,
And
Thanks for having me.
thank you. And that's going to do it for this week's episode. A big thank you to Sean White for sharing his experiences and deep insights with us. Before we say goodbye, I encourage you to follow the AI+HI podcast wherever you enjoy your podcast. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to comment, leave a review. It really makes a difference. And finally, you can find all of our episodes on our website at shrm.org/AIHI. Thanks for joining the conversation, and we'll catch you next time.